My father didn't raise his voice often. That was part of what made it land so hard when he did. "You have 48 hours," he said. Each word was measured, controlled, like he'd rehearsed the line in front of a mirror until it lost all its humanity. "Pack your things, leave the keys, and don't make this ugly." I had just set my duffel bag down by the door, still smelling faintly of jet fuel and desert dust, still carrying a body that hadn't quite learned how to be home again. I stood there in boots that had seen 3 tours and a war, only to have him slide a legal notice to vacate across the mahogany table my grandfather built with his own hands. The gravel of the driveway had crunched under the tires of my battered pickup truck, with a sound that usually signaled sanctuary. But as I pulled into the shadow of the Lawson estate, the familiar silhouette of the Victorian gables against the Pacific Northwest sky didn't offer the peace I'd spent 12 years dreaming of. I'd sat in the driver's seat for a long time, my hands still gripping the wheel, feeling the phantom vibration of the desert road beneath my palms. I was Maya Lawson, a logistics officer who had spent a decade moving mountains of steel and men across the globe, yet I found myself hesitant to move my own boots across the threshold of my childhood home. My mother stood behind him with that soft, careful expression she wore when she wanted to look reasonable while saying something unforgivable. My sister, Sloane, leaned against the counter, checking her watch as if my life were an inconvenient delay in her afternoon. And I stood there in the entryway, listening to the sound of something breaking that no one else in the room could hear. There are moments when your training takes over before your emotions can catch up. This was one of them. So I waited. I let the silence sit between us until it became uncomfortable. He looked like a CEO waiting for an underperforming employee to arrive for a termination meeting. "You heard me," he added, quieter now but sharper. "This isn't up for discussion." "I heard you," I said, "that was all." "Maya, we're trying to do this in a way that's best for everyone," she said gently. I looked at Arthur Lawson. The signet ring he usually wore was missing. He looked like a man drowning, trying to use his own daughter as a stepping stone to stay afloat. The 48-hour deadline wasn't a family decision. It was a tactical retreat. They didn't ask about the deployment. They just wanted the keys to the legacy. I nodded once, a sharp military gesture. I didn't beg, I didn't plead. I simply turned and began the long walk toward the stairs. The battle lines were drawn. For the first time in my career, I was fighting on home soil. They were busy burying me, but they had forgot that I was the only one who knew where the truth was buried. I walked up to my old room, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and realized that my mission hadn't ended at the airfield. It was only just beginning. By the morning of the first full day, the house felt less like a home and more like a maze of ghosts. I stayed in my room until the sun crested over the fir trees, watching the light crawl across the walls. My mind was still calibrating, working through the tactical implications of Arthur's ultimatum with the cold precision of a logistics officer. They had spent years convincing themselves that my frequent leave periods were spent decompressing on some distant beach. They de-painted a picture of me as the absent daughter. They were so busy with their own narrative that they never bothered to look at the facts. They were wrong about everything. I waited until I heard the heavy growl of Arthur's car pulling out of the driveway. Once the sound faded into the coastal fog, I moved toward the library. This room was the true heart of the estate, a sanctuary of mahogany and leather that still carried the weight of my grandfather Sila's. I could almost see him there, his eyes sharp behind those gold-rimmed glasses, a book on Marcus Aurelius resting on his lap. To me, it was a command center. I walked to the heavy mahogany desk and knelt on the floor behind it. My fingers found the familiar grooves Sila's had shown me when I was just a girl. With the precision of a technician, I pressed a specific spot on the baseboard. A small, hidden compartment clicked open. I reached in and pulled out the leather-bound logbook I had maintained during my final 2 years of service. It was my insurance policy. As I flipped through the pages, the truth of my supposed absences was laid bare in neat, chronological entries. I had been here, in this house, during the midnight fever spike Silas suffered. I had been here to navigate the labyrinth of his pharmaceutical needs. I had documented every single instance where my father had arrived, smelling of expensive scotch, trying to coerce a confused old man into signing. It was all there. Every lie, every predatory visit, every moment of neglect. I reached the last entry I'd made before my final deployment, but as I turned the page, my heart stuttered. There was a new addition. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged. Silas had written it only days before his heart finally gave out. He knew I was coming back. Arthur thinks he found the ledger, the note read. He found the decoy I kept in the desk drawer. The real numbers, the true record, are in the vault. He will try to push you out. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Arthur wasn't just greedy, he was insolvent. The 48-hour deadline wasn't a family decision. It was a desperate attempt to erase my presence. Arthur was trying to outrun a federal audit, and he was willing to trample his own daughter to do it. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, sharp and sudden. I quickly replaced the logbook and stood up, smoothing my clothes and forcing my face into a mask of indifference. My family was obsessed with the Victorian iron box sitting in the corner, a heavy, ornate decoy. But as I looked at the ornate wall paneling near the fireplace, I felt the slight gap in the wood grain. The wall was the hook. My sister Sloane appeared in the doorway then, her phone pressed to her ear. "Still packing, Maya?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. I didn't respond, I simply watched her. She was decorating a house of cards, while the wind was already picking up. The ghost in the wall was silent for now, but the clock was ticking. It was hidden in the steel that waited behind the mahogany, and only I had the combination. By the second morning, the house felt less like a home and more like a crime scene being scrubbed for evidence. I woke at 5 sharp, a habit the army had etched into my marrow, and moved through the quiet hallways with the silence of a ghost. The Pacific fog was a thick, wet wool against the windows. It obscured the coastline and trapped us all in a white void, cutting the estate off from the rest of the world. It was the kind of morning where sound travels differently, muffled, heavy, and full of secrets. I moved through the kitchen, the steam from my black coffee the only warmth in the room, when my mother, Eleanor, drifted in. She was already dressed in a crisp linen suit. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, every strand in its place, but her eyes were rimmed with a redness that no amount of expensive concealer could fully hide. She didn't look at me. She went straight for the kettle, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, the porcelain clicking against the counter with a frantic rhythm. She looked brittle, like a piece of fine china that had been glued back together one too many times. "Maya," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the low hum of the refrigerator. "Why are you making this so difficult? Why can't you just take the check your father offered and find a place in the city? Somewhere safe." "Safe from what, Mom?" I asked. I leaned against the counter, my hands wrapped around the mug. "I've spent the last decade in places where safe wasn't even a vocabulary word. I'm not afraid of an apartment search." She turned then, her hands trembling as she clutched a tea bag like a lifeline. "You don't understand, Arthur, he's in deep. There are people calling the house, Maya. Not the bank, not the polite people from the firm, hard men. Men who talk about collateral, as if it's a living thing they can hurt." The twist hit me right in the solar plexus. I felt the air leave my lungs for a split second. Eleanor wasn't just being a submissive wife or a social climber. She was terrified. She stood there, trembling in her expensive suit, and revealed that Arthur had already sold the house. It was an off-market deal, a desperate play with a high-end developer. My presence was the only thing blocking the final wire transfer, the only thing keeping the hard men at bay. He had sold a life he didn't own to pay for a lifestyle he couldn't afford. He promised them the Lawson gold, she said, her voice finally cracking. He told them Silas had a cache of bullion in that library safe. If they find out it's empty, or if the sale falls through because you're contesting the eviction, I don't know what they'll do to him. They're coming for everything, Maya. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the hollow shell of the woman who used to read me stories in this very room. She was begging me to abandon Silas's legacy, to save a man who had already gambled it away. I realized then that the mystery of the safe was a double-edged sword. My family was obsessed with the Victorian iron box, the decoy, but they didn't know about the biometric vault Silas and I had installed during my last leave. They were hunting for a myth, while the truth sat right behind the wall, waiting for someone with the right thumbprint. I'll be out by Friday, Mom, I said. My heart felt like it was turning to cold flint. But tell Dad to be careful. Some vaults only open for the people they recognize. Some locks don't care about desperate men. She didn't answer. She just nodded, her eyes unfocused, and hurried out of the room. I stood in the kitchen alone, the fog pressing harder against the glass. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for a house or a piece of land. I was fighting to stop a predator from devouring the last bit of honor the Lawson name had left. Arthur was ready to hand over the keys to Silas's soul, just to buy himself another week of pretending. I went back to the library and locked the door. I could hear the house starting to wake up, the distant sound of Sloane's voice on the stairs, the sharp click of her heels. They were already moving on. They were already spending the money they hadn't even touched yet. I sat at Silas's desk and felt the silver key in my pocket. My mother's fear was a tactical variable I hadn't accounted for, but it changed nothing. If anything, it made the mission clearer. Arthur Lawson had turned my home into a bargaining chip for criminals. He wanted a fresh start, but he was about to get a lesson in the kind of logistics he couldn't manipulate. The fog wasn't going to lift anytime soon, and neither was I. Friday was coming, and with it, a reckoning that no one in this house was prepared to face. The transition from morning to afternoon was marked by the arrival of an occupying force. At noon sharp, Sloane marched into the foyer followed by a staging crew of 3 men dressed in identical black turtlenecks. They moved with a clinical, detached efficiency that made my skin crawl. Within minutes, they began draping white painter's plastic over the furniture, shrouding the armchairs and sofas as if they were preparing for a funeral. It was a calculated erasure. They weren't just decorating, they were sanitizing every trace of the man who had actually built this life. It's about the lifestyle we're selling, Maya, Sloane chirped. She didn't look at me, her eyes scanning the living room like a predator marking territory. We're neutralizing the space. The realtor says nostalgia is a depreciating asset. We need it to feel aspirational, not lived in. I watched as one of the movers grabbed a box of Silas's hand-carved bird decoys. These were masterpieces of cedar and patience, each one shaped by my grandfather's hands over months of quiet labor. The mover didn't even look at them before heading toward the donation bin by the front door. My military training kicked in instantly. The heat of rage flared in my chest, hot and sudden, but I channeled it into a cold, tactical focus. In the desert, if you react with emotion, you die. If you wait for the right moment, you win. I had to let them believe they had already won the ground. I'll be out by Friday, I told Sloane. My voice was a flat, dead calm that seemed to bounce off the plastic-covered walls. I've already labeled the boxes in the library. I'll stay out of your way until 5. Sloane paused, a flicker of suspicion crossing her face. She had been braced for a fight. By giving her exactly what she thought she wanted, absolute compliance, I had effectively neutralized her ability to escalate the situation. She blinked, her polished mask slipping for just a second before she regained her smirk. Fine, she said, waving a hand dismissively as she turned back to her tablet. Just make sure you don't track mud on the new rugs. They're a silk blend, and they cost more than your truck. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a response. I retreated to the library and locked the heavy oak door, the click of the bolt feeling like the start of a countdown. I didn't pack a single thing. Instead, I pulled out my secure satellite phone and dialed a number I had memorized months ago during a late-night watch in a very different part of the world. "Julian," I said when the call connected, "this is Maya Lawson. The bait is taken. They're staging the house for a sale that legally cannot happen. They think the path is clear. Have you finalized the activation clause with the county clerk?" "It's done, Maya," the lawyer's voice came through, steady and grave. "The Lawson Family Trust was moved into escrow 3 hours ago. The secondary filings are secure. The moment your father attempts to open that safe for a buyer or sign a deed, the entire estate freezes. It becomes a legal fortress. But you need to be careful, Maya. If Arthur is as desperate as you say, he won't go quietly when the floor falls out from under him." "He doesn't have a choice," I replied, looking at the hidden panel in the wall where Silas's truth waited. "He's been playing a game of checkers. I'm playing a game of logistics. And in logistics, the person who controls the supply line wins every time. He thinks he's selling a house, but he's actually walking into a courtroom." The twist was set. While my sister and her crew were busy neutralizing the past with white linen and expensive candles, I was weaponizing it. I spent the rest of the afternoon labeling boxes, not with my clothes or books, but with the specific evidence files I would need to present to the SEC auditors. I wasn't just leaving the house. I was preparing to blow the whistle on the man who had turned my sanctuary into a house of cards. Every time I heard the staging crew laugh in the hallway, or the sound of a heavy piece of Silas's history being dragged across the floor, I just tightened my grip on the silver key in my pocket. They were redecorating a tomb, and they didn't even realize they were the ones inside it. I looked out at the fog again. It was thicker now, a wall of white that seemed to be pushing back against the house. By Friday, that wall was going to come crashing down. The twilight of Thursday settled over the coast like a bruised veil. I was in the library, the one room still clinging to its dignity, when the door creaked open. My father, Arthur, stepped in. He had traded his charcoal blazer for a silk dressing gown, but the affectation of luxury couldn't hide the way his shoulders hunched. He looked like a man trying to fill a space that was rapidly shrinking around him. He carried a crystal decanter of Silas's 20-year-old scotch and 2 glasses that caught the dying light. He moved with a forced grace, a performance of calm that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm glad you're being sensible, Maya," he said. His voice was forced into a paternal warmth that felt as thin as parchment. He poured the amber liquid, the scent of peat and smoke rising to meet the lingering smell of the old book Sloane hadn't yet managed to throw away. "I've written a check, $10,000. It's more than enough for a security deposit on a nice apartment in the city. A fresh start, away from the heavy memories of this place." He pushed a slip of paper across the mahogany desk toward me. I didn't touch it. My eyes stayed fixed on his hands as he reached for his own glass. The small detail that had been bothering me since my arrival was now a glaring neon sign in the dim room. "The signet ring was gone, Dad," I said softly, "and the wedding band." He froze. The glass was halfway to his lips, but his arm turned to stone. The mask of the successful patriarch didn't just slip, it shattered into 1,000 pieces. For a second, I saw the man Alina was truly terrified of, a man drowning in the dark, gasping for air that was no longer there. His face seemed to age a decade in a heartbeat, the lines around his mouth deepening into canyons of stress. "Everyone has cash flow issues, Maya," he hissed. The paternal warmth vanished instantly, replaced by a jagged, desperate edge. "Business is a game of levers. I'm just repositioning. It's temporary, a strategy." "You're not repositioning," I countered. My voice was steady, the voice of an officer reporting a tactical failure. You're fleeing. I've seen the ledger you thought you hid, Arthur. I know about the pass-through accounts. I know where the money went. You didn't give me 48 hours because you wanted me to find a nice apartment. You gave me 48 hours because the SEC auditors have a meeting with your board on Monday morning. You need the house sale closed and the Lawson gold in your hands by tomorrow night so you can disappear before the handcuffs come out. The twist was out in the open now, raw and ugly. Arthur didn't even try to deny it. He leaned over the desk, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the wood, his eyes wide and bloodshot. Then you know why that safe has to be opened. He spat, his voice a frantic whisper. If the bullion isn't there, I'm not just broke, I'm a felon. I'm a dead man. You're a Lawson, Maya, you protect the name. You give me that combination, and we all walk away clean. We leave this mess behind. I looked at the scotch in my glass. This was the liquid Silas had saved for a special occasion, a celebration of legacy. This was the occasion, though not the one he'd hoped for. I am protecting the name, Arthur, I said. I stood up slowly. I'm protecting it from the man who turned it into a punchline for a fraud case. I'm protecting it from you. I left the check on the desk, untouched. As I turned and walked toward the door, I heard the crystal glass hit the wall behind me. It didn't shatter into a million pieces. It just landed with a dull, heavy thud against the wood. He wasn't celebrating a victory. He was mourning the realization that his daughter was no longer a soldier who took orders, but a commander who had already outmaneuvered him. I walked out into the hallway, where the plastic-wrapped furniture looked like ghosts waiting for a haunting. I didn't look back. I had my mission, and for the first time, I knew exactly what Arthur was willing to burn to save himself. He was ready to torch the house, the history, and me. But he had forgotten one thing about fire. It only works if you're the one holding the match. And as I climbed the stairs to my room, I felt the cold weight of the silver key in my pocket. I was the one with the fuel, and Friday was less than 24 hours away. Friday morning arrived with a biting, metallic chill that seemed to seep through the very glass of the windows. I descended the stairs to the sound of rhythmic, violent thumping that vibrated through the floorboards. Sloane had escalated her neutralization project to a level of structural carnage. A demolition crew was already in the library, the screech of crowbars against ancient wood echoing through the foyer. They were prying the floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves from the walls, the very shelves Silas had built into the frame of the house with his own calloused hands. "What are you doing?" I demanded. My voice was a low, dangerous frequency that finally cut through the din. "These are structural, Sloane. Silas didn't just hang these, he anchored them into the foundation." Sloane didn't even look up from her tablet. She was dressed in an athleisure outfit that probably cost more than a month's hazard pay, looking entirely too polished for a woman overseeing a demolition. The developer's architect says they're oppressive, Maya. They swallow the light. We're replacing them with floating glass and integrated LED strips. It makes the room feel breathable. Try to keep up with the century, okay? As the crew worked, decades of dust and family secrets were shaken loose into the air. I watched as the wood groaned, the hand-rubbed finish scarring under the pressure of the steel tools. It was a physical assault on a history she viewed as an obstacle. Then, the third section near the fireplace gave way with a sickening, wet crack. A section of the shelving resisted, caught on something hidden in the framing. When it finally splintered, a small, vintage metal dispatch box, wedged into a gap in the stud bay decades ago, tumbled out and clattered to the floor. Sloane's head snapped toward the sound. The minimalist Zen facade vanished instantly, replaced by the sharp, predatory gleam of someone who had finally found the legendary gold. She lunged for it, her manicured fingers trembling as she reached for the latch. "Is it jewelry?" she gasped. "Is it the coins?" Dad said there had to be something physical hidden in these walls. I was faster. My military boots hit the floor with a heavy thud, pinning the box to the boards before she could reclaim it. "It's trash, Sloane," I said. My voice was cold and hard as a bayonet. "Just like you said Silas's things were. Just like you said nostalgia was." I snatched it up and retreated to my room, ignoring her shrieks of unfair. "And that's family property," echoing up the stairs. I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands steady as I pried the latch open with a pocket knife. Inside the box, there wasn't a single ounce of gold. Instead, it was filled with a secondary, handwritten ledger, cross-referenced with Arthur's firm's official letterhead. As I scanned the pages, the final piece of the tactical logic fell into place. Arthur hadn't just been skimming money to live beyond his means. He had been using Silas's estate as a dead angle. It was a financial blind spot where he could park toxic assets, failed investments, and fraudulent loans to make his firm look profitable on paper to his board of directors. Silas had known. The red ink in the margins was his unmistakable, jagged handwriting. "He thinks I'm old and blind," one note read. "He's using this house as a graveyard for his sins. Maya must see this. If I go before she returns, let this be the map." I realized then that the safe in the corner wasn't just a container for money. It was the final evidence locker. Arthur needed me out in 48 hours, not just so he could sell the house, but so his cleanup crew could burn these ledgers and wipe the digital trail before any auditor with a badge arrived. He was trying to incinerate the crime scene while I was still standing in the middle of it. I looked at the clock on the bedside table, 12 hours left. Downstairs, the staging crew was already painting the library a realtor-neutral gray, literally whitewashing the scene of the crime, while the paint fumes choked the hallway. I packed the dispatch box at the very bottom of my duffel bag, right next to my service weapon and the caretaker logs. I wasn't just leaving the house anymore. I was preparing for a final engagement. In 12 hours, the minimalist Zen was going to meet a very loud reality, and I was the only one who knew the house was rigged to explode. I sat in the silence of my room, listening to the rollers move against the walls below, and felt the silver key in my pocket. The clock was ticking, and for the first time since I landed, I felt like the mission was finally under my control. Friday was almost here, and I was ready for the steel to open. The morning of the final day arrived with a suffocating tension that felt like the air pressure dropping right before a flash flood. The fog had moved inland, a thick gray shroud that erased the Pacific and turned the Lawson estate into an island of ghosts. Inside, the minimalist Zen transformation was complete. The house smelled of fresh, sterile paint and expensive floor wax. It was a scent that tried, and failed, to bury the ancient aroma of salt and cedar that lived in the very bones of the building. I was out on the porch, checking the oil in my truck with the methodical focus of a pre-flight inspection. My movements were rhythmic, a way to keep my hands busy while the clock ticked down. I was just tightening the cap when the crunch of gravel announced the arrival of the final twist. A shiny, black SUV pulled into the driveway, its tinted windows reflecting the gray sky like polished obsidian. A man stepped out, dressed in a custom-tailored suit that looked entirely too restrictive for the damp coastal air. He moved with the predatory grace of someone who already believed he owned the ground he walked on. He didn't offer a name, he didn't even offer a greeting. He looked at my truck, then at me, with a sneer that made his upper lip curl in practiced disgust. "You the daughter?" he asked. His voice was like sandpaper on glass. "You need to move this eyesore. The staging photos are scheduled for noon, and the final walkthrough with the buyers is at 4. We need this driveway clear for the wire transfer confirmation." "And you are?" I asked. I didn't look up from the engine bay. I kept my voice, as cold as the sea spray hitting the cliffs below. I'm representing the developer, he said, tapping a heavy leather portfolio against his thigh. We're here to verify the vault assets. Your father promised the liquid collateral as part of the closing. We move on this property at exactly 5:01, not a minute later. Everything is timed to the second. He pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, entering the house with the entitlement of a conqueror. I felt the final gear of the tactical trap lock into place. My father hadn't just promised the developers the Lawson gold, he had promised them immediate, unencumbered access to it. He was counting on me being a memory by the time that vault was approached. He needed me gone so there would be no one left to explain that the gold wasn't bullion, it was the truth. He was selling a lie to people who didn't take kindly to being cheated. I stood by my truck for a long time after he disappeared inside, the silver key from the dispatch box heavy in my pocket. I looked at the front door, where my family was busy selling a history they never bothered to understand. I realized then that my compliance hadn't just been a strategy, it was an act of mercy they didn't deserve. My father was so focused on his exit strategy that he hadn't noticed he was walking into a kill zone. Sloane was so busy with her aesthetics that she hadn't noticed the foundation was already gone. They were all performing for a buyer who was really just a shark in a suit. I checked my watch, the final 12 hours had begun. The house was humming with the sound of last-minute adjustments, the staging crew whispering in the halls, and my mother's forced, brittle laughter echoing from the kitchen. I realized I wasn't just counting down the hours to my eviction anymore. I was counting down the seconds until Arthur Lawson's house of cards met a Category 5 hurricane. I went back to my room, the same room that had once held my childhood dreams and now held the evidence of a corporate execution. I sat on my duffel bag and waited. The air in the house was static, charged with the energy of a storm about to break. I felt a strange sense of calm. In the military, you spend a lot of time waiting for the go order. This was no different. The objective was clear. The enemy was identified. All that was left was the engagement. I looked at the fog pressing against the glass, one last time. It wasn't going to lift. It was going to swallow us all, and only one person in this house was prepared to navigate the dark. Friday was finally here. The deadline was 5 o'clock. And at 5:01, the world they thought they'd secured was going to vanish. The clock on the library mantel struck 5. The sound was thin and hollow in the newly emptied room, echoing against the minimalist walls that felt more like a stage set than a home. The Pacific fog had pressed tight against the windows, turning the world outside into a featureless wall of gray. Inside, the air was electric, charged with the kind of tension that precedes a lightning strike. My father, Arthur, stood by the fireplace, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his silk robe to hide the unmistakable trembling of his fingers. Sloane stood just behind him, clutching a bottle of vintage champagne as if it were a scepter, her face pulled tight with an anticipation that bordered on mania. She was already celebrating a victory she hadn't yet secured. In the corner, the developer's representative checked his watch with a clinical, bored precision. "The wire is staged," he said, his voice a low rasp that cut through the silence. "We have a window, Lawson. Open the safe. Let's see the bullion and we can all move on with our lives." Arthur turned to me then, his eyes wide and bloodshot, a cornered animal looking for any available exit. "The keys, Maya," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of his desperation. "And the combination. Now, you gave your word. You said you'd be out by 5. I didn't move. I stood in the center of the room, my mud-caked military boots a deliberate, jarring insult to the pristine, realtor-neutral rug they'd laid down to hide the history of the floorboards. I observed the room one last time, The fake plants, the glass shelves, the coldness of it all. I didn't reach for the Victorian iron box, the heavy decoy they had been staring at for 48 hours like it was a religious icon. Instead, I walked to the wall where the mahogany bookshelves had been torn away, leaving behind the pale, naked scars of Silas's labor. I pressed a specific knot in the framing, a detail Silas had shown me during a late-night talk years ago about the hidden places in a man's heart and a man's home. A silent, hydraulic hiss echoed through the room. A section of the wall, perfectly disguised by the fresh gray paint, slid back with a heavy, mechanical hum. It revealed a state-of-the-art biometric vault, its steel face gleaming under the recessed LED lights Sloane had insisted on. "What is this?" Sloane gasped, her champagne bottle slipping an inch in her grip. "That's not the safe." Arthur stepped forward, his breath hitching, a frantic hope lighting up his face for a split second. "No," I said, my voice echoing with a finality that silenced the room. "This is the anchor." I pressed my thumb to the scanner. The red light pulsed, then turned a steady, mocking green. The heavy steel door swung open with a sound of absolute, irreversible weight. Arthur lunged forward, his hands outstretched as if to catch the yellow glint of gold bars. He expected the clink of coins, the physical proof of his salvation. Instead, he was met with the cold blue glow of a high-definition monitor mounted inside the vault. The screen flickered to life. Silas appeared. He was sitting in his favorite armchair, the one Sloane had dragged to the curb, looking directly into the lens with an expression of profound, quiet disappointment. It was a message from the grave, and the room went cold. "Arthur," Silas's voice filled the room, amplified by hidden speakers, until the very floorboards seemed to vibrate with his presence. "If you are seeing this, it means you have finally tried to sell the one thing I asked you to protect. It means you have prioritized the price of a house over the value of your own blood." The developer's representative went still. Arthur's face turned a sickening shade of gray, the color of the fog outside. Silas's eyes seemed to bore into him from the screen. "I knew you would come for the gold, Arthur. But the only gold in this family was the time Maya spent holding my hand while you were busy stealing from your own clients." The monitor began to scroll. It wasn't showing stock tickers or bond prices. It was a forensic accounting of every illegal wire transfer, every pass-through account, and every toxic asset Arthur had tried to bury in Silas's name over the last 3 years. The evidence was undeniable, laid out in the cold light of Silas's meticulous record-keeping. "The house is not yours to sell, Arthur," the recording continued, the voice like a gavel falling. "It was moved into an irrevocable trust 6 months ago. Maya is the sole trustee. She is the only one with the power to sign a deed. And as of this moment, Arthur, she is the only one who can decide if you go to prison or if you simply go away." The room fell into a silence, so absolute it felt physical. The minimalist zen was gone, replaced by a raw, crushing reality that none of them could stage their way out of. I looked at my father, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a patriarch or a titan. I saw a small, hollow man standing in a room he no longer owned, listening to the voice of the father who had finally seen through him. The steel was open. The lies were exposed. And the Lawson name, as they knew it, had just fallen apart. The silence that followed Silas's recorded voice was more deafening than a mortar blast. It was a vacuum that sucked the air right out of the room. It left my father, Arthur, gasping like a man drowning in 6 inches of water. He stared at the screen, at the cold, hard numbers scrolling past his own father's face, and he seemed to physically shrink. The developer's representative was the first to move. He didn't offer a word of comfort or a legal reprieve. He didn't even look at Arthur. He simply snapped his leather portfolio shut with a sound like a pistol shot and walked out of the library. His heels clicked a sharp, dismissive rhythm against the hardwood as he headed for the door. The wire transfer wasn't coming, the rescue was dead. The shark had smelled blood in the water and decided the meal wasn't worth the hook. The resolution began not with a bang, but with the measured, inevitable entrance of Julian Vane. He stepped into the library with two men in dark windbreakers, federal auditors I had been coordinating with since my second night back in this house. They moved with the quiet authority of people who deal in facts, not facades. Julian stepped up to the mahogany desk, placing a stack of documents on the surface with a heavy thud that sounded like a coffin lid closing. "Mr. Lawson," Julian said, his voice a cool, professional scalpel. "As the legal representative for the Lawson Family Trust, and at the direct instruction of the trustee, Maya Lawson, I am here to facilitate the immediate seizure of all business ledgers and digital records found on this property. We have been in contact with the SEC for weeks, Arthur. The dead angle is gone." Maya stopped this. Sloane finally found her voice, though it was shrill and brittle, cracking under the weight of the moment. She dropped the champagne bottle. It didn't shatter on the thick, expensive rug, but the vintage liquid bled into the fabric, staining the realtor-neutral ivory like an old, deep wound. "We're family, you're destroying us. How could you do this after everything Dad has built?" "Family shows up, Sloane," I said. My voice was steady, echoing the same iron-willed resolve Silas had shown on that monitor. "Family stays when the coffee goes cold and the medicine is hard to swallow. You and Dad didn't want a family, you wanted an estate. You wanted a liquidation. Now you have the paperwork to prove you have neither. You spent 48 hours trying to bury me, but you forgot that I'm the only one Silas trusted to hold the shovel." The legal dismantling was surgical and absolute. Because Silas had moved the house and the core assets into an irrevocable trust while he was documented as being of sound mind, thanks to the meticulous medical logs and caregiver records I had kept during my leave. Arthur's contract with the developer was not just void, it was a fraudulent attempt to sell property he didn't own. The twist that finally broke him wasn't the loss of the money, but the total loss of his leverage. To avoid an immediate indictment for the missing client funds he tried to park in Silas's name, Arthur was forced to sign a full confession and a restitution agreement. It stripped him of his firm, his reputation, and every remaining asset he tried to hide. I watched as my mother, Eleanor, finally moved. She didn't go to Arthur's side to comfort him, she didn't even look at Sloane. She walked slowly to the window, looking out at the thick, unmoving fog. Her polished veneer had finally crumbled, leaving behind something raw, hollow, and unrecognizable. She realized that by choosing Arthur's secrets and his polished lies over my truth, she had inherited his ruin. She had helped stage a house of cards, and now she was standing in the debris. They left an hour later. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic exits. Just the sound of heavy suitcases being dragged across the floor, and the muffled click of car doors closing in the driveway. I stood at the library window and watched the red taillights of Arthur's SUV vanish into the white void of the Pacific fog. The minimalist Zen house was empty now, stripped of the people who had tried to turn it into a commodity. For the first time since I'd landed on that airfield, the air in the house felt clean. The pressure was gone. The ghosts were still there, but they weren't screaming anymore. I turned back to the room, looking at the biometric vault Silas had left for me, and realized the mission was finally over. The house was quiet, and for the first time in 12 years, I wasn't waiting for the next order. I was the one who had given it. 2 weeks later, the Pacific fog had finally retreated. It pulled back like a defeated army, leaving the coastline sharp, brilliant, and raw under a cold spring sun. The Lawson estate sat like a sentinel above the churning water. Its Victorian bones were no longer draped in plastic or shadowed by the suffocating weight of Arthur's debt. I spent the morning moving Silas's books back onto the mahogany shelves. I had forced the developer to pay for the repairs as part of the settlement, and the new wood grain hummed under my palms. Every volume felt like a piece of the house's soul being returned to its proper place. I handled each book with care, from the thick, leather-bound ledgers to the worn collections of poetry Silas used to read when the rain wouldn't stop. I walked out onto the porch carrying a ceramic mug. It was the one with the thin crack along the handle, the one that had survived a dozen moves, 3 deployments, and a decade of service. I sat in the chair Silas used to favor, the one that caught the late afternoon light just right. I looked out at the metallic blue of the water, opening up between the fir trees. The house was quiet now, but it wasn't lonely. It was the deep, resonant quiet of a base after a successful mission. The air smelled of salt and cedar, the honest sense that Arthur had tried so hard to spray away with lemon oil and ego. The human lessons Silas had tried to teach me through the safe, and the struggle finally crystallized in my mind. He didn't leave me the house to reward me for my service. He didn't leave it to me as a prize for winning a fight. He left it to me because I was the only one who understood the true cost of the anchor. I was the only one who realized that respect is not a sentiment you feel or a word you say. It is a series of difficult, inconvenient, and often invisible actions. It is the grit to stay when everyone else is looking for a profitable exit. It is the integrity to value a legacy over a price tag, even when the world tells you that everything is for sale. I realized then that my 12 years in the Army hadn't taken me away from my family. They had prepared me to save it. The discipline, the tactical patience, the ability to see through a smoke screen, those were the tools I needed to protect what Silas had built. I wasn't just a daughter who chose a uniform over a dinner party. I was the guardian Silas knew I would become when he watched me leave for the first time all those years ago. He had seen the crack in the family foundation long before I did, and he had spent his final years making sure I was the one holding the mortar. I picked up his copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations from the side table. It was the same book he'd been reading in the video he left for us. I turned to the final chapter, the one Silas hadn't finished before the end. I read the words that would now guide my own life. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. I let the book rest on my lap, feeling the weight of it, the solid truth of it. The fog was entirely gone now, revealing the jagged, beautiful horizon of the coast. I felt the silver key in my pocket, not as a burden or a secret anymore, but as an anchor. I looked at my truck parked in the driveway, its dust a reminder of where I'd been, while the house behind me stood as a testament to where I belonged. My father had wanted a fresh start by erasing the past. My sister had wanted an aspirational life by ignoring the foundation. But I had found something better. I had found the ground. I was Maya Lawson, I was a soldier. And for the first time in 12 years, I didn't have to look for home. I was already there. Thank you for staying with Maya until the end. This story is a testament to the fact that truth doesn't need to be loud to be final, and that character is the only inheritance that truly matters. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you reading from right now, and what time is it there? If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss our next journey into the heart of human values. Let's keep going. The concept of home is often mistaken for a structure of wood and stone, or a mere line in a legal ledger. But the true foundation of any legacy is built upon the quiet, often inconvenient act of showing up. We live in a world that frequently rewards the loudest voice, the fastest profit, and the most polished image, yet these things are nothing more than ripples on the surface of a deep ocean. True value is found in the stillness of the depths, in the integrity of a person who remains steadfast when the tides of convenience turn. Respect is not a title to be inherited or a trophy to be displayed. It is a debt of honor paid in the currency of presence. To respect another human being is to acknowledge their inherent worth beyond what they can offer you, and to guard their dignity even when there is no audience to applaud your sacrifice. As the ancient Stoics believed, we do not control the storms that rattle our windows, but we possess absolute sovereignty over the light we keep burning inside. When we prioritize the aesthetic over the authentic, we risk becoming architects of our own emptiness. A life well lived is one anchored in the realization that our greatest duty is to be the silent guardians of the truths others are too hurried to hear. The final measure of our character is not what we take from the world, but what we refuse to let break under our watch. In the end, the only structures that truly endure are the ones built on the bedrock of unfailing reliability and the quiet, iron-willed courage to stay. Thank you for journeying through this story with me. It is a reminder that while the world may try to rewrite our roles, the truth remains written in our actions. I would be honored to hear your thoughts. Where are you listening from today, and has there been a time in your life when staying was harder than leaving? Please share your reflections in the comments below. If this narrative resonated with your heart, consider following and subscribing to the channel to join our community. Your support allows us to keep exploring the deep human values that ground us all.